There we go. And so if you think that you're going to the SWIP workshop on critical constructivist grounded theory, then you're in the right place. And I'm happy to see you all here. I'm Professor Heidi Levitt I'm usually at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, but right now I'm doing a visiting chairship at the International Psychoanalytic University in Berlin. And so zooming to you from there. And this is sort of a little overview of our workshop of the time we're going to have together the next couple of hours. First off, we're going to talk about a little bit about just giving you an orientation to critical constructivist grounded theory, a little bit about, well, what is grounded theory at all? What is constructivist? What is critical? And then talk about some of the research aims and questions that are particularly appropriate or good for this method. And then I'll go in and talk a little bit more about the steps of CCGT and in terms of both data collection and analysis. And we'll think a little bit about perspectives that we bring as researchers to this approach, and we'll do a little bit of skill practice along the way. And I'll end with a quick note about methodological integrity. And then we'll have some questions and answers in the last, I'm going to try to get to keep the last 15 minutes or so. So this said, if you have clarifying questions, or if there's something that just doesn't make sense and you need to understand it to be able to keep participating and understanding what's going on, then please feel free to put those questions in the chat. And Zachary Whip has been kind enough to volunteer to help us with that process. And so if there's something that should be asked, then he'll help to ask that. Okay, so who am I? I am a LGBTQ and psychotherapy researcher, and I am also happy to say that I was a past president of the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology, or SQUIP, as we like to call it. I've authored a couple of books, The Essentials of Critical Constructivist Grounded Theory, which is what I'm really talking and focusing on today with you, and then also a book on reporting standards in psychology for qualitative research. I have chaired the SQUIP recommendation committee for designing and reviewing qualitative research, as well as the APA task force for developing article reporting standards for qualitative research that I know that Michael Bamberg was part of, who I see is here, and other awesome qualitative researchers. I'm also the incoming editor for Qualitative Psychology in 2023, and I've been honored to receive the Distinguished Contributions to Qualitative Methods Award from Division 5, which is where in APA, which is where SQUIP is located. And so today, this is a little bit about me, right? So I thought it would be nice to hear a little bit about you, folks who are here, and wanted to ask if you might let me know a little bit about where you're coming from in terms of coming to this class. So you can enter into the chat, either A, B, C, D, or E, if you haven't learned about qualitative methods yet, if you learned about them in maybe lectures or so, but you haven't taken a course, if you've taken a course on one qualitative methods or qualitative methods but not used them, or if you have not taken a course but used qualitative methods, or both. So yeah, it's awesome. I love seeing people respond. And so there's a lot of folks who really have been using qualitative methods and learning about them, which is so awesome to see. And some people who are just beginning, right, and coming into it. And so I'm excited to see that too, right, because it's an exciting journey to be on, right, getting to learn about these methods. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, please feel comfortable to keep using the chat as things come up. So what is this approach, right? Well, grounded theory research is an approach that was developed by Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss in 1967. So it was one of the first qualitative methods that was really formalized and became quite popular as a qualitative approach because of this. And the goal was to encourage the field to think about theory formation. And the goal was to think, well, we're so focused, and especially at this time, so focused on theory verification, but how do we form the theories that we're verifying, and where do they come from? And so grounded theory was developed as a method in order to have an empirically based way of developing theory. So things that we then later might test or evaluate using quantitative methods would have an empirical basis, right? And would be well developed for our purposes. And it's a little bit of a confusing approach in that there's been many versions of grounded theory that have been developed. Even the two founders of grounded theory, Glaser and Strauss, split and developed their own methods each that are different in important ways, and the same in other ways. But this complicated the field, right? In terms of how is grounded theory understood and how does it work? There's been realist approaches to grounded theory that have been developed. Kathy Sharma's Constructivist grounded theory and David Rennie's version, which is, I think, similar. Both have become very popular in psychology. And Adele Clark developed this situational analysis, which is an adjunct to grounded theory, which is based upon using different kinds of charts and diagrams to try to increase researchers' perceptiveness within the grounded theory process, and especially focusing on critical kinds of methods. So there's all these different kinds of variations, which makes it really important when you're writing up grounded theory or doing grounded theory to think about what are your premises, right? Which approach are you using? Because otherwise, when you do your work, people won't understand what you're doing. And they'll think you're doing one approach when really you're doing something different. So it becomes important to sort of clarify. And these approaches have different kinds of epistemological assumptions, but they all have similarities in that they all guide researchers to take text, interview text, and then divide it into units that then get organized into categories that reveal patterns and structures and processes that are common across the different pieces of individual data. And so the approach that I'm focusing on today is a critical constructivist grounded theory approach, which is based to some part on David Rennie's approach, but really adding a critical twist to it. And so let's talk about, well, what is constructivist qualitative research? Grounded theory has long appealed to constructivists because it initially was formulated with a strong concern about the social basis of meaning. And constructivist researchers have long been interested in looking at how people interpret the world, right? What are the kinds of lenses that we use? What are the metaphors? What are the frameworks that we use to make sense of things that are going on for us? We also, constructivist researchers, are interested in thinking about, well, how is meaning constructed across people so that it's intelligible, so that it makes sense, so that we can communicate, and so that meanings and constructs become dominant, become the common kind of way of viewing a topic or an experience, and sometimes other experiences aren't, right, are pushed to the side or aren't focused on in society or in many places, right? And they're also interested in how, as researchers, when we come to our projects, we're working with our participants to co-construct meaning. So there's an awareness that as researchers, we're not coming to our project as a blank slate, right? We do our research because we are interested in that question, because it's important to us, right? People don't say, well, I'm just going to randomly focus on a topic to research for the next 2 years of my life, I'm going to roll die and pick a topic. And so it's usually, right, focused on something that we care deeply about. And so we have to think a lot about, like, what are we doing in our interviews with participants and in our analysis, and be very careful and mindful about how we are using our own ideas, and whether that's shedding more insight into our data and helpful, and sometimes it can be very helpful, or if it's overshadowing the participants' experiences and blocking them out so they're not really being seen, which also could happen. So these are things that constructivists are very concerned with, right? This is close to the hearts of constructivist researchers. Okay, let's see. All right. So critical researchers, right? What does it mean to be a critical researcher? And doing critical work has also been important and relevant to granite theory from the very beginning, because the Glaser and Strauss were really interested in social power dynamics. And again, I was saying how Adele Clark developed situational analysis, which uses sort of diagrams to draw out, how are different aspects of, how are different people in different groups in society interacting with this phenomenon, how are different understandings of this phenomenon being used, right, and to organize those things. And that's something that you can definitely do using CCGT. But generally, I think what's important is to understand that critical researchers are interested in understanding, like, what is the socio-political structure that your phenomenon is embedded in. So asking questions like, do processes that are associated with privilege and oppression influence your phenomenon? Is marginalization, is that part of this experience of this phenomenon, or could it be? Are there ways that power structures people to understand this phenomenon as being important in some ways but not in others? And really thinking about, how can I develop findings that are emancipatory, that can further social justice kinds of ends, that can shed new lights, that can provide new supports, that can challenge understandings that might be oppressive. Right? So these are all concerns for critical researchers, and often critical and constructivist research ambitions go hand in hand, because when you think about the idea that politics and the way society is and how power is structured is influential, then you also, I don't know, it's not letting me use my buttons and my keyboard. Let's see. Oh yeah, so then you also are thinking about, you're also thinking about meaning, right? And the construction of meaning, and how is a meaning constructed in association to power, and how is meaning created, held by different groups. And so often these kinds of ideas are held closely, right? But this is an approach where both are really thought through a lot. And so we'll give some examples here. So types of projects, types of research questions that you might have, right? If you're approaching, if you're thinking about doing a granite theory study, probably most commonly, granite theory studies in psychology have been focused on developing an understanding of an experience, right? So I want to develop an understanding of the experience of loss, or I want to develop an understanding of this experience of oppression, right? And the idea is to create categories and a hierarchy of data categories that will help to shed and provide some structure to that understanding. So we might learn that, okay, well, the experience of oppression is characterized by these different kinds of components, right? And these kind of components seem to be organized in these ways. They occur on different levels. So there's an interest in developing an understanding of this experience and its structure and its components. Similarly, people have been doing this kind of work to think about identity groups, to thinking about oppression, as I was saying. This approach is also really useful if you're trying to develop intervention, like an educational intervention or a treatment or a training, because it does organize the ideas that are about your phenomenon into categories and organizes those categories systematically. So then you might say, well, I have this part, these categories that all are focused on this aspect that will be day 1 of my treatment, and these ones will be day 2 of my treatment, and these ones day 3 of my treatment or training or whatnot. So it's really useful for that. It's useful similarly for the same reasons in terms of in developing a stage model, because you can organize the data by stages. You can organize the data by thinking about processes, which could be really helpful if you want to develop principles for practice. And you can also develop theory, right, from it, which is what it was originally meant to do. So it can be also useful in that kind of a way to develop a grand theory. So I want to talk a little bit more about data collection. And so we'll spend the next little while focused on that, which will be useful to give you more of a sense of how this unfolds. So typically in data granted theory studies use a semi-structured interview to collect data, but they don't have to. It's okay to use granted theory if you have text. There's been analyses of slave narratives that have used granted theory approaches, where there's written narratives that are analyzed, and that's a fine way to do it. But what you really want to have is data that will be complex enough and have enough insight that will support a granted theory analysis, because it's a pretty intensive analysis. And if your data is very superficial and doesn't have a lot of depth in it, then it may not be as useful for you, right? There are other methods that may be, not as time intensive. But you could use written or recorded data as well, but typically semi-structured. And really thinking when you're developing your questions, how can I create questions that will really allow me to develop insight into meanings, intentions, and these socio-cultural dynamics? Because if these are the things that I'm wanting to talk about in the end, my questions need to ask about those things in a compelling kind of in-depth way. And creating interviews that give you the space and the time to really go into, right, what are these meanings is centrally important. Any questions that you have that could be answered in a quantitative shape or form, better to put them outside of your interview, so then you can really use your interview time in a rich way to gather rich kinds of data about people's experiences. Something that you'll want to do in my classes when we're doing projects, we begin off, right, to doing this immediately, where we'll begin off having each of us as researchers record and think about what are our assumptions about this topic? What are the things that we are expecting to find? Are there things that we're hoping to find, right? And as you become, and this could be done, we often will write about this in a kind of a memoing. Memoing is a procedure used in granted theory, which is basically like note-taking or journaling. You could engage in team discussions. Often we'll have repeated team discussions throughout our research projects to think about what are our assumptions? Are they changing as we're getting more, into the data and we're learning more? Am I learning about and becoming aware of new assumptions that I didn't know of before? And how are these assumptions that I'm holding, how could they affect how I interpret the data, right? Or how I approach the interviews? And this can be incredibly important, right? Because then I don't just come in with my own expectation and then ask questions to confirm my expectation. expectation, right? Like that's what you don't want to do. But I can use my expectations to help me ask better questions. I can use my expectations to help me interpret and ask questions more accurately, right? Even during the interview process itself. And in the analysis, I can use I can think about, well, what are the theories that I hold, right? And those theories may help me see things in the data that could lead to a better analysis. So this kind of really thinking about who you are as a researcher and as a research team becomes really an important and valuable discussion, right? It lets the whole group, if you're working in a group, have a lot more sensitivity to the data and to things that they're hearing from participants. So I would think I was saying that it's important to collect data that's rich enough to enable explorations of meaning that are deep. If you just sort of ask a question and then immediately go to the next question, and then immediately go to the next question, you may be you're losing the chance to explore, well, what does this answer to question 1 mean, right? You could easily spend 20 minutes or 10 minutes just exploring one question to fully understand, what does that mean? How is it experienced? In what context does this answer occur? How does it, right, happen? And this depth of understanding is much more likely to give you interesting and new kinds of understandings and data than if you just ask a question and get a person's like first initial answer and then go to the next question, right? Because then you're missing like all of the mining and exploring of what those answers mean and how are they held. Recruiting and selecting, I often think about recruiting participants who have insight into the experience. So I've had people say to me, well, could I do a study interviewing people on what it's like to not be divorced, right? And it would be very hard to do that because I don't know what it's like to be divorced, right? So how do I know what it's like to not be divorced? You have to sort of, the more lived experience people have, the more insight people can share about the experience that you're interested in, the better your data will be, because they'll have more complexity that they can bring, right? And they'll be able to talk in much more vivid kinds of ways that could let you develop new insights. So thinking carefully about, well, who are the people who will have the most insight on my question, right? And how can I recruit them, right? And is often an initial first question, right? And then how do I ask questions that will really let them explicate that insight and really share what that was like for them. So in terms of data collection, we're talking about how you're gonna think about your positionality. So this means that I'm not only thinking about what are my expectations and understandings, and my interests in this topic, but I'm also thinking about like, what is my position as someone in the world coming to this topic? And how might my position make me aware of some things and also not aware of other things? So some of the research that I've been doing has been interviewing, some of the projects have been asking people about their gender experience. And so we've done work with communities of mostly African-American gay men and trans women about their experiences of their gender in house and ballroom communities. And my positionality is that I am a white lesbian woman, middle-aged, right? And quite different. And so there are many life experiences that I don't have coming to this interview. And so it means that I have to think about all the biases, all of the expectations. I don't like the word biases, but all of the perspectives, right? I don't like biases because it kind of implies, the word bias kind of implies that there are people who don't have bias, right? And so I like the word perspective better because everybody has a perspective. And I think that this is the case as researchers. We all have perspectives that we're bringing to our research. And so I have to think about, well, what is my perspective, and how does my being white, middle class, lesbian woman, how does this all separate me out and make it harder for me to understand their experiences? And what kinds of questions do I need to be asking to better understand that experience? I want to be thinking about the perspectives that are on the margin of this experience. So often as researchers, we think, as critical researchers, we think about how phenomenon, in quantitative research, we're often looking at the mean or the central, the most common kinds of experiences. But in qualitative research, we get a much more comprehensive view of the subject that we're studying. If we ask people who are on the margins of that experience, what are the limits of this experience? Where does this experience not work? Who does it not work for, right? These are all really important questions. I also think about the power between me and my participants, right? So if I'm coming into doing interview research with a group of LGBTQ youth, I'm going to probably wear like jeans and a t-shirt and introduce myself as Heidi and be super friendly and informal, right? Because I'm wanting to reduce the power that's already so present, and that might make them feel uncomfortable sharing their experiences with me, and make them feel hesitant, which will reduce, it'll make it a less pleasant experience for my participants. It'll reduce the quality of my data and then my findings. I want to think about the ethics and the demands on my participants. So, I actually want to go back. I want to, but this could be quite different when I'm interviewing, like in a study, I interviewed religious leaders, right, about their thoughts on domestic violence. And then I wore a suit and I had my card and I gave people my card, and I was very careful to be super professional and formal, because in that context, that would be helpful in terms of creating safety, creating comfort, and a space where people would be happy to talk with me. And so thinking about this idea about how is power working, thinking about ethics, is it okay for me to be, who is it okay and not okay for me to be inviting to even participate in research? What kind of demands does our research take? And if we're studying groups that are marginalized and that don't have access to a lot of resources, then thinking about how are we going to be taking more of their resources, and what are we giving back, right? So, so thinking carefully about what can I do as a researcher to be giving back, right, to the groups that I'm researching, and that there could be many different ways of giving back, including thinking from the beginning about what is it that that group needs, so that the questions that I ask are relevant, right, and important for them. Thinking about who as a research team, who is on my team and what perspectives are they bringing, and how able are they going to be to think about what will be useful for this group when we're trying to figure out what to do with our findings. So these are all ideas that can be important. Thinking about, recruiting participants and also co-researchers who are located in different positions, right? It would be better for me if I'm in the community of gay men and trans women. It's important for me to make sure I have both gay men and trans women because they have really different experiences in terms of their gender, in terms of how this community receives them. So, so thinking about what are the different positions that people might have that will be important for me if I want to get a thorough understanding of how this phenomenon works, right? So qualitative research ethics. So thinking about, so the qualitative interviewing can happen long before you're actually in the room with the participant. Sometimes people work for years to develop trust with the community, to develop contact with the community, to work together to form questions that would be relevant and important for that community. So that way, when they're in the research room, they have a question in a topic and maybe fellow researchers who all are relevant and important and will make people who are participants feel comfortable and heard, and thinking about how that translates in terms of the gains that will follow from the research, right? Consent is a process that's really important. So being sure to review your consent agreement before the interview and letting participants know that they can decline to answer questions, they can take breaks, they can ask for clarifications, they can stop the interview, is really important to have people be comfortable. And this is the case across qualitative methods, really. I often receive questions about, is it okay for participants to discuss painful kinds of experiences? And I think that it's important for researchers to be able to do that kind of work, because sometimes the things that are most important about the phenomenon we study are that there are painful aspects of them, or difficult aspects, or challenging aspects, or and so it can be fine to ask people to talk about things that are painful. If they agree to participate in your interview, then they know upfront what the topic of the interview is. And so they've agreed to talk about things that are in the scope of that topic. And so, so thinking about that, talking about painful things is okay if it's in that scope. And if it's not just because of your kind of idle curiosity, or and if it's not because and also important to think about that line between being a therapist and being a researcher, right? So you wouldn't want to begin working with a client, with a participant, and then start thinking about them as a client, right? Because the person has agreed, even if you have like an amazing intervention that you think, oh, this will totally work with this person and help them, that person didn't agree, they didn't consent to be in therapy with you. They consented to be doing a research interview. So keeping clear what that is. And also thinking about, is this going to be traumatic for the participant? And if it does seem like it's going to be too traumatic, thinking about, well, what does that mean for my interview? Is it still, do I need to be interviewing people who are currently in therapy so that they have a current support to help them? Do I need to have support resources available for them? How can I keep checking in with them to see if they're doing okay if I'm unsure? So these are all important kinds of questions that you'd be thinking about when you're approaching interviewing, right? Because you're thinking about interviewing not just in terms of getting data, but you're thinking about these dimensions that are more ethical and have to do with power and how this is structured, and making sure that you're empowering your participants. It can be useful to think at the beginning, are there things that you can give back? Maybe you can do a presentation about what you've learned to the community that you are studying. And that could be helpful, right? And maybe it'll make changes that help people. So I wanted us to think a little bit about actually asking questions in an interview. And I'm going to divide us up into small groups in a moment so that we can try to do that. But what I'm going to ask you to think about is this question. Oh, sorry, I flipped ahead when I didn't mean to. This question, which is, what is your experience of anxiety like? And we're going to have this as like the frame for our interview. And I'm going to want you to think about these following kinds of questions, right? So one is like, who would you want to recruit so you can obtain rich, informative data about this experience of anxiety? Thinking about the kinds of variations within the participants that would be important to look at. Think about what kind of sub-questions would be important to ask, right? How do I make sure I have a thorough understanding of this experience? And then also thinking about how could I phrase the questions to be non-leading? How could I be sure that I'm creating like an open space so participants can answer anything that feels relevant to them about this experience of anxiety? I might need to ask them if they you know, if they can focus on one experience, right, and what it's like, I could do that. We'd be assuming that if we are recruiting people that this experience of anxiety would be important. And typically people will order their questions from more general to more specific. And so you can think about what are the more general questions we want to ask, and then what are the more specific questions that we want to ask. We don't want to ask the very specific questions first because it may be closing the participants' attention and keeping them from answering things. Maybe their mind would have gone in many different places and we've sort of limited the field. So we start off being very open to really hear fully where they want to go. And then there may be things that we know we are have been identified as being important in our field related to this phenomenon that we want to be sure to ask about. And then usually at the end of interviews, I usually ask questions about the interview itself. So I usually ask questions like, what haven't I asked in this interview that seems important related to this phenomenon, right? So I want people to get to tell me. And sometimes I learn all kinds of things, right? People will say, well, you didn't ask me about this and this. And then I know, oh, shoot. So then I can do two things. One, I can ask that question in my future interviews. And two, I can say to the participant, oh, well, now that you've said it, could you tell me about this and this, right? And then I have a whole new window to collect data that I would have missed otherwise. So, so I'll often ask questions like, how did the interview feel? Are there any questions that I didn't ask that seem important? What was it like to talk to me? Sometimes people might say, well, it was uncomfortable talking to you as a lesbian woman, so I didn't want to talk to you too much about gay sexuality. And then that again gives me the chance to say, oh, okay, well, that's really good to know. What are the things about gay sexuality that you know, do you feel comfortable sharing with me any of the things about gay sexuality that might be important? And so it gives, again, a window to capture that data. So I'm going to divide you into groups and encourage you to kind of play with this for a little bit, right? Thinking about what are the questions that are important. And I'm going to ask you maybe to take a screenshot of this screen, because I don't know, I'm going to try to paste this into the chat, but I don't know, sometimes things don't seem to work out with Zoom. So I went around to the groups, and I tried to go in as many groups as I could in the time, but I even let the time go a little bit longer trying to, but I wasn't able to go into all the groups because there were so many great discussions and people thinking about recruitment and how to ask questions in many different ways. I made some notes about the kinds of things people were talking about so I could share them back with you, right? So some things that came up were ideas around how a lot of our questions are within semi-structured interviews aren't structured, right? So we usually think as researchers about like, what is our main question? Grounded theory, because you're thinking about what is my theory of something, or how do I develop an understanding of something? Usually there's one overarching question, right? Which is like, what is that thing? And then, and then within that, there are some questions because there may be ideas or aspects of that thing that you want to not forget to ask about. Like if I'm asking about people's experience of gender, I may want to remember, I need to ask them about their experiences within LGBT community, their experiences within their romantic relationships, their experiences within workplace, their experiences developmentally. So there may be different sorts of things that I want to ask. And I write those down as sub-questions. But again, like we talked about before, within those questions, when I get my first answer, there are many unscripted questions that I may ask to really fully understand what the meaning is that someone's saying, right? So yesterday I was doing a role play on for another workshop group about a psychoanalyst's experience of learning this a different approach, and he was talking about that he felt like the approach was mothering, right? So I would want to know, mothering, what does that mean, right? Like, I may have a sense of what it means for me, but I don't know what that means for him, right? And so I would ask all these questions about mothering that weren't in my question protocol list, right? But they're responding to me trying to really clarify and understand the first answer he gave me, which was about how this approach that he was learning felt mothering. And so in that way, you're often asking many questions that aren't listed. Another question that I was asked was about variation. So people were talking about how they're thinking about the variability within their group. And there was a question about, does this mean that it's more, is this because I'm interested in getting more diversity to support generalization? And it is relevant to that. So because you're sort of setting as a researcher the scope of your question, but within the scope of the question, you're wanting to get as much variability as possible so you have a comprehensive kind of answer. If you say, well, I'm going to have a very homogeneous group, they're all going to be exactly alike, it means you're probably going to get answers that are very similar and that are missing a lot of other people's experience. And so your analysis in the end won't be as generalizable, it won't be as useful for as many people because you focused on a very narrow segment of people within your group. And this is why you're thinking in the beginning, at this point, when you're developing your questions, you're thinking about, right, if you're being a critical researcher, who am I interviewing? What is that going to be telling me? What is it not going to be telling me? Who do I need to be interviewing to have a full picture of what this phenomenon is? And learning about that from your own knowledge about the phenomenon, from what the literature says is important in the phenomenon, from looking at what the participants are telling you, right? Because you'll learn from them about the kinds of variation that are important. And then asking, and you can always interview people who are, if you're not sure, that could be like, I'm not sure, is race important to this or not? I might want to deliberately get some racial diversity and find out, is this important or not for my phenomenon? And then I know, right? Often experiences that are like race and gender and ethnicity are so powerful in our lives that they often influence so many things. So often I'll think it's not unlikely, right? Even if there's not literature on that it's important. And so I may want to recruit people. Let's see, Nancy, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? I think there was a question that you had that I kind of cut off, but I'm not sure.
I think it was the one that you were just talking about. I was really trying to understand. I understood the variability, but was the aim then to generalize within that variability or tell the diverse range of themes that were heard? Like, how do you deal with that variability is what I was trying to understand from your perspective.
And so when you're writing about that variability, you'll write about for participants who were, this experience was like this, except for participants who were in this social class. And then it was like that, right? So part of your answer can be, part of your themes can be definitely framing that kind of variability and bringing it forward in a way that people can see. It'll make your research, it will be more generalizable and more useful because now I know when it applies and when it doesn't apply, right? So this is all part of like what you're thinking from the beginning of your analysis and going through. I'm going to share my screen again, and but it was awesome to hear people really thinking about different questions. And I think just the process of doing that thinking is something that you can take with you. Of course, like if you look at my book or if you look at other qualitative literature, you can keep thinking about different guides for developing questions. But the experience of engaging in that together can be really useful. I wanted to show you a couple of interviewing examples so you could get a little bit of a sense of how this looks. So here, I'm going to show you first a poor example and then a better example. And And let's see, Michael Bamberg, would you mind helping me to read this? Because I know you're here and you're often willing.
I can, if you don't mind my accent.
Oh, I love your accent.
The interviewer asked, tell me about your experience of anxiety.
Well, my heart.
Participant answers,
yeah,
well,
so
my head starts racing and my heart is beating fast. I just feel so out of control. I hate that feeling.
So, okay, I'll be the interviewer, you be the participant. Mm-hmm. When does this occur?
Good. I think that's a good thing. It happened mostly when I'm feeling out of control.
And what do you do to stop it?
I try to remind myself that it isn't helping and I should take some deep breath and relax, but it doesn't always help.
Mm-hmm. What are other strategies that you use?
Well, I try to distract myself sometimes. I have some exercises that my therapist gave me, but I rarely do them.
I see. And when did you begin feeling anxious?
Probably when I was about 10. I think it was around the time that I changed schools when my family moved to Maryland.
And how does this anxiety affect your relationships?
All right, you've got to check. Oh, here we go. This is a long story. I would say that it doesn't affect most of them so much. I think people just think this part of the way that I am. Sometimes it helps that I worry about things because it means that other people don't have to. Like I remember having an argument because my cousin never remembers my kids' birthdays, but I always remember these. I have them all in my calendars with reminders and cues enough ahead so I can have presents ready. My cousin, though, is not as careful with this as she often forgets about my kids, which really hurts their feelings. And it upsets me too. She always was a pretty spoiled kid. She just got pretty much everything she asked for from her parents without having to work for them. She had the most in-fashion clothes and was really popular. In high school, she was a cheerleader and always was in the in crowd. I wasn't that way, and I always thought she should have been trying to include me more as my cousin. But she never really thought about me then either, and I was never invited to those parties and wasn't included.
It sounds like that was really hurtful to you and like you were really jealous of her.
Well, I don't know that I wanted to be popular so much, but I wanted her to think about me and to want to include me in her group of friends. I remember another time when we all went out together in a large group. We were in a club and I went to the bathroom, and when I came out, they all had just left. They apologized after and said that they just thought I was with them when they left, but I felt really hurt.
Okay, could you tell me a little bit about how your anxiety affects your relationship with your family?
I think mostly they aren't so affected. It is hard for them to tell all that is going on in my mind and all that I am worrying about each day. I mean, they see some of it, but it's just the tip of the iceberg.
All right, thank you very much. So here we have some things that are happening in the interview that are not going as well. So I want you to just get a sense of what you see is happening. And then Zachary, would you mind reading with me this one?
Sure.
So I'll be the interviewer. So tell me about your experience of anxiety.
Well, my head starts racing and my heart is beating fast. I just feel so out of control. I hate that feeling.
Can you tell me more about that out of control feeling? Out of control of what?
I guess out of control of my future. Like it feels like everything is going to become bad and spiral in some downward way, and I won't be able to do anything to stop it.
I see. Like you can't stop it.
Yes, it feels like I'm paralyzed.
Why do you think it feels like that?
Well, sometimes there isn't anything I can do about a situation, and I think it is a bad situation, and I'm scared about how much worse it will be.
Can you give me an example?
Okay, I found out that my daughter is being put into a basic science class. This made me so upset. She has a learning disability and has been working really hard to keep up to her classmates. I can just imagine what this will do to her self-esteem. And I can imagine that she will feel worse about herself and that it makes so much harder for her to try. Some kids like challenge, but she sort of beats herself up and convinces herself that she can't do things when she hits an obstacle. I can envision that this generalizing to other things and her feeling like she can't do anything. And I panic because I feel like I can't stop them from putting her in that class. It's not up to me. And I don't know how I can make her feel differently about herself and her potential for learning. I'm afraid also that socially, she'll feel ostracized from her friends and will feel lonely.
And what happens to you when you think about this fear?
I just feel so out of control and like I can just see her whole future disappear. Part of me knows it's just a science class and she doesn't even want to go into sciences, but part of me feels like it's her whole future. I don't want her to feel less than other kids. And I feel like it's my job to protect her as her parent, and I'm failing her. Like I'm a failure and have no worth if I can't keep her from having a horrible high school experience. I feel so overwhelmed and powerless. I want to throw myself at the teachers and beg them to help.
It sounds like you feel when you're anxious, like you're doubting your own worth and thinking you can't protect others, that you're failing irreparably.
Yes, I think this is why I'm so anxious a lot of the time. A lot of the time, it feels like I'm failing and I'm a failure. When I think I might not do well at something, or that people will not like what I'm doing, or will judge what my kids are doing, I just get caught up in a loop of worrying that I can't escape and I can't change how the system views her.
It's hard to stop it. Even if a part of you knows that some things are not up to you, there's bigger systems. What does it feel like to have your family be in this system?
Well, I worry about advocating too little, but also too much. In my culture, we're always read as being pushy, and I worry that the teachers will take it out on her if I ask for too much.
Can you tell me more about this cultural aspect and how it influences your anxiety in this context, or maybe others as well, if it's relevant there? So thank you, Zachary. Thank you, Michael. And so I'm wondering if you could notice what people could write in the chat, differences that they noticed in the interviewing styles. What are things that seem different to you, or that maybe seemed like they were stronger in the second interview, or things that seemed like they were better? I don't know if folks can write in the chat any sort of impressions that you had. About the interviewer. All right. Okay, now they're coming in for me at once. So the first interview didn't probe further. So you could see the first interviewer, when the question answered, they didn't go deeper into the answer. They just went to the next question, went to the next question. So people are saying that it felt like they were moving through a checklist, right? Whereas the second interviewer was going for more depth and understanding. The second interviewer was picking up on cues and asking open-ended questions. And they got a lot more detail about the experience of anxiety because of it, right? They weren't just getting the first superficial answer that anybody might say and then going to the next thing, right? There was a lot more depth. And also they kept the interview more on topic. So it stayed on track and it wasn't meandering, right? The second interview sort of lost control of that. And second one kept focused, on the experience of anxiety. There was a whole segue where the interviewer was letting it go off and talk about a family and a cousin that was like totally not relevant to anxiety. And so you could see like that central things, right? On yeah, and it did feel like this first interviewer was putting in some statements that could have felt quite judgmental, like you seem jealous, right? Which people might object to or feel kind of a little bit offended by. And also the second interviewer was moving to ask about the cultural context, right? Was picking up when there were things that were being said that were about culture, right? And not just letting them go by, but asking about them. So we could see that there were these kinds of differences, and these are in part because you're thinking about like, how do I really get data that's going to help me understand how this person is constructing meaning? What are the contexts that are leading to this anxiety? What are the cultural dynamics, the interpersonal dynamics, and going for depth about those kinds of answers, right? And keeping on track. So I want to talk about analysis because I'm mindful of our time. I've talked a little bit about this, but I'll go into more depth. So usually when you're conducting an interview like this, you might have a bunch of, a number of interviews, often grounded theory. I'll talk about that in a moment. So you might have a bunch of interviews and then you divide the interviews into units, right? And what I tend to use are meeting units, which I borrow from phenomenology. Georgi developed this idea, which is basically like a unit of text that each contain one answer to your question or one central answer. And I pull out from each piece of text that I think has an answer, I write a label for that answer, right? What I think that answer is. And then I try to make my label be as meaningful, as evocative, as reflectful. It's often not just a one-word label. It's often, my experience of doing drag is important to me because it lets me claim femininity even though I'm a man. That might be a label for a unit, right? So it could be meaningful and it can reflect the contexts that are important for the thing you're studying. After you go through your interviews, usually I would start off with like 3 or 4 interviews maybe and unitize them and label them. I go through a process of comparing those units to each other. And my goal is to build categories that identify patterns of meaning in that answer and that aren't replicating my question. So I wouldn't have, like in the example of asking about people's gender experience, I wouldn't have a category that was like my gender experience at work, my gender experience in my relationships, my gender experience in LGBT community, because those are my questions. My questions are, what's your gender like in LGBT community? What's your gender like at work? What's your gender like, in this context? And so I don't want my categories to replicate my questions, which I think is really important because I see that happen often. But to really be answering the questions, right? So what is the answer to those things? And then as I create these subcategories, I begin to think about, well, what are the relationships between them? And think about commonalities across them. And so for the different categories, maybe organized into categories that contain them and that are a little bit more abstract because they're having to group together different concrete examples of something. So they're more pulling forward what's the something that these are concrete examples of. And then I continue to do that. So I might have categories that I look for commonalities across to group into clusters. And typically in grounded theory, you end up with having a core category, which is sort of what you think of as being the central kind of meaning that's really organizing the different meanings in your hierarchy. So like for my example of my study on butch lesbians, gender experiences, the core category had to do with authenticity, was seeking authenticity, right? Because in the different clusters that were the answers to their experience of gender in their workplace and in their relationships and in different communities, they kept talking about the importance of authenticity, right? So core categories I find to be very, very useful because it allows you to, and this is something that is, I think there was a question about thematic analysis. This is something that's often different from thematic analysis. This idea of a core category allows you to really center, like, what do you think is the core thing that people should take away from your article? And so I really like that. Another two things that are really coming from grounded theory specifically, procedurally, are this idea of theoretical sampling. So this means that as I recruit data, so if I recruit a wave of like 5 participants, I might analyze those interviews. And then as my hierarchy forms, I can start to look at my hierarchy and think about what's missing. What are the parts of my hierarchy that aren't fleshed out? So like, for example, I remember doing a study on LGBTQ people's experience of the marriage amendments. And we realized that when we went to the hierarchy that we didn't have any real discourse about people who had children, right? LGBTQ people who had children. And that was a big gap in terms of how the people are affected by marriage amendment legislature, right? Because it absolutely influenced their experiences and their rights to their children and their family dynamics. And so we thought, oh, we're missing that. We better go back and recruit in our next wave people who are LGBTQ who have children. And so, so it's a type of purposive sampling that that allows you to be informed by your data, right, as you're doing the study, and can really enrich, right, the kinds of diversity that you can bring and the kinds of answers you can shape. The second idea that comes from grounded theory that's really important is this idea of saturation, which is a brilliant idea that Glaser and Strauss developed, which has to do with knowing when you have enough data, right? And what tends to happen is that in my first interview, when I'm creating these subcategories, I create tons of subcategories because every answer I hear, it's the first answer at the time that I've heard that answer. But as I've created these subcategories, what happens is that in the next interview, there's more redundancy with the first interview, or there's some redundancy with the first interview and some new questions. And then I might put that second interview, the units might get slotted into the subcategories that are already formed, and then I may create some new ones from that second interview. But after I've interviewed 15 people, there's going to be many more categories that have already been formed, and and a lot less new data and new categories, right, that are being shaped. And so this is telling me that there's more redundancy that's happening, and that I'm getting closer to having a quite comprehensive hierarchy, and that I can stop collecting data. So it's a really nice argument for that. Zachary, I see your hands up.
Oh, yes, I just wanted to throw out a few questions that were asked in the chat that I think are relevant to this. The first one from Archo is, should or how do we select units and leave some data out of analysis?
You would select your units by what are units of data that are answering your question. So if there's, like in that first poor interview example, there was a whole section that was focused on the participants' like cousin, which didn't answer the question at all, right? So you would totally leave that out because it's not answering your question. But then any piece of data that's providing an answer to your question, so, you know, what is the experience of anxiety, or what does butch gender mean, right? The units are all going to be shaped and developed because they contain an answer to your question. So whatever you see as being like one answer will be one unit, and then you could go on to the next answer.
And then another question from Annie saying, so we are not doing line by line coding in this approach. You're
not doing line by line coding. You're really thinking about meaning, right? And I think this is one is much more efficient than doing line by line coding. But it makes more sense if what you're interested in is how is meaning constructed, right? And how are meanings shaped socially and interpersonally and interpsychically. And so the focus on the meaning becomes your this becomes your unit, right? And you give a label to each one and then you move forward, as I've been saying. Yeah. Is there any more?
Yes, we just have one more asking, what about subcategories that fit in more than one category?
You can put subcategories in as many categories as they fit into, and that's perfectly fine. So don't feel any restriction on that. Again, your goal is to develop like the most comprehensive understanding of your phenomenon, the best, the most useful understanding of your phenomenon. And so you may have an idea that there may be a category that is absolutely relevant to more than one thing, and that's totally fine. It can go into more than one thing. It's totally fine. So, so here I want to talk a little bit about just things to think about when you're analyzing data. So thinking about things in terms of, so these are issues that you would think about to hold the critical constructivist lens, right? So you don't lose this focus, right? Sometimes we get so caught into like our data that we start to almost missing things in our data, right? Because our perspective narrows, right? So keeping in mind to notice when participants are talking about change across time, right? So in my gender research, participants talk about how, well, I had this sense of my gender, and then I came into this community and my sense of my gender changed, right? And so noticing how context and how interpersonal relationships, these things can all change the meanings that we have. Thinking about the social spheres that our participants are interacting in. And this is where, you might make diagrams of like, oh, in this sphere, this is the experience, and this sphere, this is the experience. And that could be really helpful, right, as you're trying to conceptualize what's going on here. And thinking about, well, what are the functions of the kinds of categories that I'm considering, right, or that people are talking about and that I'm shaping. So like for my gender work, I think about not just like how do people experience gender, but also what is gender doing for people, right? So how do I, as someone who has a sense of having a femme gender, what does that do for me? Why do I have that sense, right? How is it helpful for me? And that can shed a lot of light on what does that gender experience mean, right? It lets me communicate who I am. It lets me conceptualize a sense of myself. It lets me communicate within LGBT community who I am. So these things are all things that you're thinking about. Also, you are free and free to bring different kinds of critical theories to enhance your ability to see dynamics in the text. So if I'm looking to hear about women's experience of workplace oppression, I am going to bring my feminist analysis, right, to that data so that I can notice what's happening in the data. And there may be times where the participant doesn't notice that this thing that I'm describing is absolutely reflecting sexism in my context. But I can see, right, because I have a feminist theory that I can kind of use to help me understand what's happening. I can see, oh, person after person after person is telling me that they get talked to in a condescending way or whatnot. I can see, oh, that to me seems to be, I'm going to think about that in terms of what does that mean in terms of the gender relationships. I think a lot about when I'm thinking about data analysis, I often think about research teams and participatory methods. So who are the best, having multiple people can be helpful in thinking about analysis of the data. I often like to think about, well, what are the perspectives and positions that people are bringing into the analysis? I don't think that you always have to work with a research team. Sometimes having one person who's very deeply engaged in a phenomenon and has been doing the interviews and has been really engaged in the analysis may be way more insightful than having a whole group of people who haven't, who all have been more superficially engaged, right? So there could be reasons for having one person do analysis, but also if you are working in research teams, really thinking about what are our perspectives. Do we have people from the community or who have lived experience with the phenomenon we're studying, or a connection? Are they on the team, right? Are their insights being used? And really thinking about like, what are the aims of my projects? And so when you're developing your categories and when you're in your analysis, you're kind of thinking, you have almost like one leg kind of outside of your analysis, thinking about how am I going to use this finding, and how can I word this finding and frame this finding so it'll be the most powerful or the most effective in advancing the aim that I have, right? If I'm doing qualitative research because I want to try to make structural changes within a system, then I want to try to frame the findings in a way that is going to be really heard by that system, right? Because that's one of my aims. And that may be a different way of framing my findings than if I'm trying to present it to a group of researchers who are detached from my phenomenon and it won't affect them. And they're not really focused on trying to make changes, right? They're just, so I'm thinking really, even in the beginning when I'm developing my units and when I'm asking my questions, right? I'm thinking about how am I getting to this end of having data that will advance my aims. So here is this little bit of transcript. And what I want you to do in this part is to really think about the ideas that stand out. This is part of an interview that I did on gender for gay men who do drag. And it's a mock interview, but it's based on those interviews. So thinking about what stands out as describing the participant's sense of gender, right? So I want you to really think about what kinds of ideas come up for you. Are you hearing that are said and also that are not being said, right? And you can just put them in the chat, right? Whatever you are noticing as I'm reading it. And I'll just do both. So interviewer, can you help me understand how you experience your gender? The participant says, well, most of the time I feel like I'm male. Friend one always tells me how surprisingly masculine I can seem, especially when we're playing football. But sometimes I'm very feminine and I feel a shift inside myself. My partner thinks that this seems to come out more when I'm feeling playful. It seems like a way to express fun more. The interviewer says, can you tell me what about the connection? Sorry, can you tell me about the connection between fun and femininity for you, right? The participant says, there is a freedom that comes from being feminine for me. I feel like I've been told all my life that this is taboo, that there's something wrong with being who I am, right? Kind of a shorter, more soft kind of man. Here, the things that are problematic about being a man become fabulous, right? This is exciting. So put in the chat things that you notice, that you see, that you learn from what this participant has been saying. How do you see femininity and drag gender differently? Well, it's changed over time for me, but I think femininity is more being passive, has got to do with being proper and controlled. It has to do with having less power. Doing drag is being out there, though, in your face. It's taking up space and being noticed. What is it like to be noticed in this way? Well, usually it's great. Sometimes not. When I was at the club, there were some straight men who were leering at me. I didn't like this at all, and I was upset because they were making comments and being jerks. This sometimes happens. I usually can just find a catty remark to make that shuts them up, but I had just had a fight with my boyfriend, and I guess I was feeling really sensitive at that moment. And I wanted to leave the stage because they were not only calling me names, but harassing one of the other girls. So that's the end of my little transcript. So what are things that strike you about gender here that you learn, right? One person writes, it was interesting how the participant used their partner's perspectives as resources for understanding, right? Relationality is what I saw. Beautiful, right? So noticing how that gender isn't just within the participant, but it's also like thinking about, how does my partner see me, right? How are these guys in the club who are leering at me seeing me, right? How does that affect how I feel about my gender and how my gender even feels to me, right? Any other thoughts? Feel free to write them in the chat. I think other things that, so another person wrote, temporal and physical spaces leading to differing senses of gender. So in different spaces, if I'm in a bar, if I'm with my partner, if I'm playing football, my sense of gender might be quite different, right? Even in those activities. Another person writes, the experiences embedded, so the shift from masculinity to femininity, how they're contained in the self, right? And the experiences embedded in masculinity and femininity, right? So what are the experiences that we associate with masculinity? Clearly for this participant, like football may be one. And what are those that are associated with femininity? And they clearly have to do with power, because you can hear the participant talking about how femininity is seen as being less power in some way, but doing drag is being feminine, but also having a lot of power in some way, but not in another way. And so trying to map this all out, right? Like, how is power being structured? Super, super interesting, right? Why I love doing gender work, because you can map out, like, in this space, this is not powerful. In this space, the same thing is powerful. In this space, my gender has this meaning. In that space, my gender has a totally different meaning, right? In this space, I can access, I can let myself feel a broad range of my gender experience. And in that space, I can't, right? So thinking about all of these different kinds of dynamics become really helpful in the research. So we're not just we're noticing what the participants are saying, but we're also noticing, well, what does it mean that they're saying? What are they saying about the process of constructing meaning about this topic? And how is it being constructed? And these are all super useful things that as you're creating your meaning units, you can be unitizing about, right? The same meaning unit may have a unit, maybe you may create one unit about the same paragraph that's focused on content, another meaning unit about the same paragraph that's focused on the context in that paragraph, another meaning unit on the same paragraph that's focused on the relational dynamics, right? So you could have many different kinds of meanings that you're pulling forward, which I find super exciting, right? As you're developing higher order categories, you are things to be careful about are avoiding themes that are obvious, right? So I think probably the most common thing that I see as a reviewer and as associate editor are people who create themes that are repeating their questions and not their answers, right? So being careful that you're not having a category that's like ways gender influence personal relationships, which is your question, not your answer. But then also thinking about not being repetitives and thinking about how can I word that framing to really be advancing the new piece of knowledge that is in my theme or that is in my category, right? So not just replicating findings that have been established many times. Like I was associate editor for psychotherapy research, and I can't say how many papers that I ended up looking at that would basically say the alliance is good, right? Having a good relationship is good for therapy. And it's true. Having a good relationship is good for therapy. So that's nice. But it's also kind of obvious, and it's not going to advance us very much because there's tons and tons of research that says that, right? So thinking about how can we think about our data more deeply, thinking about the critical, the constructivist aspects, and really pulling those things forward lets us see patterns of differences that may be more helpful, and that let us note like how, what are commonalities and differences in experiences that can be powerful. Let's see. All right. So category titles, just like meeting units, can vary in length. There's no reason why you have to have a 2-word or 1 line or 1 phrase category title. If you need to have a 2-line or 3-line, that's fine. And really thinking about, you know, what's going to be useful, right, for the field, and what's going to be best reflecting that experience that you're studying. Which brings us to methodological integrity. And I'm going to make a short note I'm going to make a short note of this in a couple of minutes and then draw us to have a Q&A question. So think about the questions that you want to ask, because I'm going to be happy to answer them. So this was a concept, methodological integrity, that was developed by a task force of SQIP, right? So I'm always happy to be presenting about this within SQIP and to SQIP members. And the idea here, the central idea, is that research should be conducted in a manner that's coherent with the researcher's aims, epistemological perspectives, and study characteristics. And so I'm reading this because I think it's really important to get this message that the idea is that you don't just say, well, you know, this method is characterized by like 6 steps. These are the 6 steps. This is what I'm doing, right? But instead that you're really thinking about, well, what are the aims of my specific project, right? What are the characteristics of my specific participants? And then thinking about, how do I adapt my methods or adjust my methods all through the process, and my questions and how I write about my methods, right? How do I make adjustments with whatever method I'm using, right? So that I can have answers that have the most fidelity, which means that they really capture the experience that people are telling me about in a clear kind of way, right? That really reflects those answers. And also that has utility, so that my answer can be useful in the field, right? There's no point in developing an answer that doesn't advance anything, right? Or doesn't give people new ideas, or doesn't move people to see something in a different way, right? And so this is part of what you are, you know, really thinking about through the whole process of analysis. And in the Critical Constructivist Grounded Theory book, and in my work, this is, and this approach, this is something that you're really thinking about, because you're thinking about both the critical and the constructivist parts, and trying to really be mindful of your procedures, right? So, all right, this is just a picture of fidelity of our map for methodological integrity, but I'm not going to go into all of that. So, so the focus of this approach then is to really walk researchers through the process of thinking about making the decisions that fit their own questions. So if you are, you know, so for instance, like in my dissertation, I did an analysis on types of silences, and found that researchers had been just tabulating silences together and adding them together, and then conducting research questions looking at whether they related to outcome or alliance. And my main finding was that they couldn't be tabulated together, because they were totally different. There were totally different subsets of experiences people were having in silences in therapy. And so I decided I'm not having a core category because my main message was there's no core, right, for silences in psychotherapy. There's these different few experiences, or number of experiences. So you could totally adjust your method, even leaving out things that seem central in this process if you felt like this is not representing my phenomena. Thinking about this stuff at the beginning is super helpful. It'll let you be able to defend your choices at the end and put you in a better position when you're trying to describe what you did to readers and reviewers. And it'll let you advocate for a more sophisticated way to approach qualitative methods. So you're being mindful of the procedures and the decisions that you're making. Also, I like that idea of developing a hierarchy because the formation of having data in a hierarchy can allow me to have many different options. And in terms of what I do with the data. So I've used granted theory analyses to develop treatment recommendations, or to identify items for a measure that I might want to develop, or to identify processes that people go through developmentally, or to identify processes for a process measure, right? So there's many, many different things that you can do that you may not even be thinking about in the beginning, but it gives you a lot of flexibility. So something that I enjoy. And I just think it's really fun, and encourage people to make it their own and feel free to make changes and adapt things to fit with their own projects and goals. So I'm going to stop here for questions. So please feel free. I know there's a little bit of a lag, and but please feel free to write any questions that you have. I know there were so many great questions that were coming up in the groups when I was going around, and hopefully my thinking and talking with you has if it left you with some, then you can ask, and I'll be happy to answer. Mohammed.
Hi, Heidi. Thank you for this amazing, insightful seminar on critical constructivist grounded theory. I just wanted to ask, as part of this approach of doing grounded theory, do we also include or use the critical constructivist lens when doing up the interview guide or during the data collection phase? So for example, going back to the early example of experiences of anxiety, so do we include interview questions to focus on sociopolitical structures, power differences, or marginalization as participants talk about experiences of anxiety? Or is this lens only used during the data analysis phase where we ask what's going on here that participants may not be actually be aware of? Yeah.
It's an excellent question. And you definitely want to be doing that as you're planning your data collection. So if I'm doing research, on, trans people's experiences of anxiety, I definitely want to be asking about how is your anxiety affected by being trans people in the world and being in a cisgender society. Like, that's going to be a really important thing for me to try to ask about, right? If I want to get a sense of trans people's experiences of anxiety. So if I don't have the question in advance, it's going to be really hard for me at the end to do my analysis and to pull out that data because I didn't ask the question. So I now don't have the data, right? So this is why it's so important to think really carefully, right? When you're first creating that's why we spent really the most time in the beginning of like thinking through your question and thinking about interviewing, because if you don't have good data, it's super hard to recover, right? In a qualitative study, because you're stuck with analyzing what you have. I see that there's a question about what steps would you recommend to learn more. So here's my book on the screen, so you can feel free to, you can get it. I think it's like there's a whole series of these books on different kinds of qualitative methods. And I think that they're like $15 each if you're an APA member on the APA website. So they're not too expensive. And you can get a couple of them and figure out what methods are best for you or whatnot. But this would be probably the easiest way to learn more about this approach. Cameron, I saw your hand was up. I don't know if you have.
Yes, Heidi.
Yeah.
I was wondering, I'm a novice researcher considering doing a grounded theory study for my dissertation. I'm researching the experience of nostalgia in the context of a life review, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on just going, from general questions to more specific and just how best to really elicit meaningful and rich data?
Yeah, I usually try to think about what is the most open kinds of questions that I can ask in the beginning. So, so you might begin with something saying like, so I'm assuming that your participants have had some sort of engaged in some sort of life review process with you.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so you could say to them, what was, so a very broad question could be something like, what was this experience like of engaging in this life review process for you, right? And you can see sort of what they say, because it may be that they don't say nostalgia, right? And then it could be good to know, right? If that's not one of the things that they say. But then if they don't say that, because your interest is in nostalgia, I would ask that after, right? So I would first get like, is this even coming up for people? And then, but I wouldn't want to not ask it, because sometimes in interviews, people may have an experience of something, but they may not say it because there's just some other thing that's more important to them, right?
Mhm.
Or because they think that you probably already know that thing, or because they think that that thing is like is commonly known, right? So there could be many different reasons why people don't say something. So if you have a specific interest in something like nostalgia, then I would ask, after you get a sense of what was your experience generally like in this life review process, then I would ask, I was wondering if you had any experience of nostalgia, right, during this process and what it was like, because then you already have a sense of the broader thing, which you could decide, depending on how committed you are to nostalgia, you could decide to follow up with other things they say, but then you don't want to lose
Right.
the chance to have them talk about the thing that you're super interested in, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? I'm not sure, but don't be shy. I'm happy to.
I think we have one in the chat. Who's asking, are you familiar with the critical realist approach to grounded theory? And can you say how it differs from the constructivist approach, if yes?
I think about the critical realist. Well, I think about the critical realist approach. I think about David Rennie as being an example of the critical realist approach to grounded theory. And it's quite similar to the constructivist approach in terms of the kinds of things that you would do and the methods that you would employ. It's different from the critical constructivist grounded theory approach because it doesn't have the same kind of emphasis on thinking about power and context and privilege and positionality, right, in the research process. So that would be sort of the bigger gap that I would see across the methods. By designing questions that conform to categories that you hope to, fill, is there a risk of confirmation bias? Yes. Okay, this is a great question. So, so you're not creating questions to conform to the answers, right? You're trying to create the questions as broadly as possible. So, so if I think, oh well, I think that men who do drag are going to be influenced by that in their romantic relationship. I mean, I know I've analyzed a lot of data on this already. So, if I think that they're going to be influenced in their romantic relationships because they may have partners who are insecure, right, by their having comfort to express their gender in a broader way. I wouldn't ask, do you feel like your partners may be insecure? Right? It would be way too focused, but I would think about like, this could be a thing. And I would try to create a broad question that would let them answer many different things to that. So I might say, how do you feel do you feel like your partners are influenced by your experience of doing drag? And if so, how? Because they may answer in a way that fits with my idea. But it gives them a lot of opening to not say that and to say many other things that I didn't think of, right? Often, so I guess the other thing is the hope to fill, right? Is I don't usually hope to have a certain answer, right? I'm usually really interested in what are people experiencing and how is that, what is that experience like for them? And so I'm really trying to not lead to any specific answer. And I'm always surprised. I don't think I've ever done a grand theory analysis and not learned things that surprised me. Because I think that what I was trying to say, I guess, before was that if there's a specific question that you're very focused on, you can ask it, but I would ask it only at the end, right? I would ask it after you've already done the broader exploration. And it depends on how you set the scope of your question, right? So if my scope of my question is nostalgia, then that would be something that would be introduced a lot sooner than if my scope is how do people experience life interviews, right? Which would be a more, it could be a more open scope, but it may not be your question, right? So thinking about how that connects.
May I ask the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Heidi, fantastic presentation again. I wanted to know that if you have used Georgie's way of analysis, and that's he has used it in descriptive phenomenology, how is critical constructivist grounded theory different from descriptive phenomenological analysis? Because the process is similar, quite similar. That's what I can see.
There's similarities and differences. They're both a categorizing kinds of methods. A big difference is that in Georgie's approach, the focus really is on essential experiences within a phenomenon. And so the interest is in what is the experience that holds for everyone for this phenomenon. And here, this is quite different, right? Because I'm interested in how is the phenomenon played out and experienced differently, right, for different people. So that's quite different, right? And then I'm also, I think in terms of thinking about bracketing, like so in Georgie's approach, the idea is that you try to be aware of your assumptions and then put them to the side, right? And here you're trying to be aware of your assumptions, but you're also mindful, and this is a term that David Rennie developed, fallible bracketing, right? You're mindful that you can't completely put them to the side because you're stuck in language. You can't get out of it, right? You're stuck in your culture. You can't get out of it. And so it's a process of trying to move to the side and not be too attached to the ideas that you can push aside, but also trying to be mindful of what are the things that I can't shift out of, and how can I ask questions? Like if I know I'm a white woman, I'm interviewing Black men who are trans, what do I need to ask, right, to help, because I know that the questions that I have that make sense in my world may not be the important questions, right? So I'm thinking about that in a critical kind of different way, and thinking about that bracketing in a different kind of a way. I hope that helps. There's a last question about visualization, and then I'll just end. The visualization can be totally used as Strauss, one of the originators of grounded theory, used a lot of diagrams, right, as were very central there's different pieces that he's written on using diagrams. Adele Clark, he uses situational analysis. It's basically a method of creating diagrams. And so it depends on, it's up to you really. So it depends on how well that helps you see your data. And sometimes I find that having, like I typically will have a hierarchy because I feel like having the picture of the hierarchy and how the data is organized, I find that's incredibly helpful. But you can absolutely play and explore with different kinds of diagrams to capture the sense that you have of your image, and that would be great. So I think that we're out of time, and I don't know if but I guess I want to say thank you so much for coming and joining today. And I really enjoyed speaking with all of you. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in the Script conference, and hope that I'm looking forward to enjoying that time, right, together. So awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi.